Welcome to The Gaze. I am glad to see you on a digital platform of New Europe, a platform where we will show you all the significant events in the region and speak about it. I'm Ksenia Smirnova, and it's my show Talk for More Details. And today we will speak about the collapse of the Russian economy. And I'm so glad to present today's guest. It's Alexander Skiba, assistant professor in the departments of economics and finance, University of Wyoming. Hi.
Hello, it's very nice to be on your program and very nice to be one of the first guests on the new format of Gaze.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm glad to see you again, actually, to be honest.
Very good to see you too.
So let me start with a short question, and I will wait for a short answer, and then we'll get deeper into details. So 11th package of sanctions is on its way. How do you think, as we see, Putin doesn't give up his intentions to continue the war? So economy of Russian Federation is ready for 11th package. How do you think?
I think that the sanctions are getting tougher, and they're getting more comprehensive. So I think it will have more and more effect on the debilitating effect on Russian economy. To be frank, I think that the oil embargo and the price cap on oil probably has the biggest effect, because the sanctions, they are not the short-term, they will not have the short-term effect. They will have effect on the long-term ability of Russian economy to rebuild and to build weapons so they can continue this brutal war and brutal invasion of Ukraine. So those sanctions are probably looking a little bit further forward when we think about the effects. They will not have an immediate effect because, there are stockpiles. They can try to find a way to circumvent the sanctions by trying to find alternative sources or produce things domestically. But the oil price cap, that's I don't know if we put it inside the sanctions, but that's the one that's really hurting their economy, and I think they're feeling it.
We will talk about its long-term effects a little bit later, but now I propose to dig deeper into the situation that are planned by economists in Russian Federation. Let's talk about the budget of Russia. So I add some data and we will discuss it. So the Russian budget deficit has already exceeded the plan for the entire 2023 and continues to increase. According to the results of January-April, it amounted to a record 3.4 trillion rubles. Although in autumn, the Russian authorities plans that for the whole year, the figure would be significantly less. It's 2.9 trillion. The situation is worsening amid rising spending on the war against Ukraine, as well as a decline in oil and gas revenues. They have decreased by 52% compared to 2022. To cover the deficits, the government uses funds from the National Welfare Fund. They, according to economists, are likely to be enough for the next couple of years, but the authorities will have to cut other expenses or borrow from the population. So my question is, how soon will the money for the war run out of Russia? And actually, we are talking about the Russian economists. So, Alexander, they are saying or prognosing that they will cover these budget gaps from the rest. My question is, from what remains, or from what rests, from what sector of the economy they will take this money, and which sector will suffer the most?
I am glad that you asked that question specifically about which sectors will suffer, because I just want to emphasize that I agree with you that that's the right question to ask, because the big question of when will they run out of money is tough to answer, because the answer probably is never. They will find new margins where to cut the spending. So here's what I will tell you. I think that they will cut the spending. I don't know which specific sectors, but I can tell you what those sectors are so you can understand the mechanism of where this will have to be to come from. It will be, my guess is that there will be the least concentrated sectors, so that the sectors don't have a strong political presence in Kremlin and don't have strong oligarch ownership. So those will be easier to cut or to tax or to levy whatever they can do to increase their revenues. Second, it'll be sectors that are probably the closest related to the government, vertical structure of power, because then they can just, in some sense, they're not that different from being part of the government. They can just tell them to do. And third, I think this will be the sectors and the areas that are away from the centers of possible political unrest. They're cutting the oil revenues, and then at the same time, they're trying to spend more money on, building tanks and whatever weapons they use. And so they're getting squeezed quite a bit. And so I think that what we're seeing now is the reason we don't see immediate big effects is because they're trying to squeeze and kind of pull a little bit from different parts of the economy. And I think, I think it will be the concentrated factors, the concentrated sectors that are closest or most directly under the control of the government, or oligarchs who are related to the government, and regionally distant sectors. If people in Moscow doesn't see that suffering, then that's going to take longer for them to revolt.
I see. But you reminded about the energy prices, and I want to add some more information about this. It's interesting. In total, high energy prices in 2022 brought the Russian Federation an additional $227 billion. So how do you think these amounts will be helpful? And helpful for which period of time, and for what needs it will be used?
So the number that came in, so remember, the number is still lower than what they were getting before. And the second thing to remember that I think sometimes people miss, when you look at the raw number of how much oil was sold by Russia, right? One of the important things that we shouldn't overlook is that the cost of production of oil in Russia is higher than anywhere else in the world. So when we say that Russians, for example, are pumping more oil and they're charging lower prices because of the cap, which came in, the numbers that you quoted wouldn't include fully the effect of the price cap, because it wasn't fully active at the time. But now, when the price cap is squeezing their revenues, it's being squeezed against a much higher base, which is the cost of how expensive is it to pull oil out of the ground. So Saudi Arabia, I think, estimated about $45 per barrel, as opposed to 17 in Saudi Arabia. So in other words, from every barrel, they are getting less and less. So the amount that they're getting, so it might be a little misleading, because remember, it's not, that money doesn't go directly into the budget that can pay for their military expenditures to finance the war. It's still a big amount, and honestly, it's the only amount that they have left, because it doesn't seem like the rest of the economy is recovering. I don't know if I answered your question, it's hard to see how long. But it's a far smaller number, and it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
I got this, but I want to add, talking about the budget, some more interesting information that I've found in the international media. Experts say that Putin actually can take loans from Russian banks to continue the war. So it's interesting. A lot of banks are under sanctions, and you said it will be artificially using the money of oligarchs and big businesses in Russian Federation. But for me, it's interesting how long time he can squeeze it out from business. And if it is artificial situation, so it will affect on financial system. And what we heard before, that the central bank was the one that could cope with the situation for a long time. Do you think what will be this year? So it will ruin this ability to cope the situation if he will just loan and loan and loan from Russian banks, except for those banks that are under sanctions. How it happens?
Yeah, I think that first of all, you're right. So borrowing from within the economy has a real cost because that money is not going somewhere else. So in other words, if the consumers consumers through the banks, obviously, they borrow money from the banks, but where do banks get money? They get it from deposits, savings and banking, operating expenses and all that. And so if government borrows more money from the economy, it'll essentially, what it does, it takes live money from the hands of the private sector, households and firms, and gives them little paper. Well, they're not paper, obviously electronic, but IOU notes saying that, hey, I'm going to pay you back in the future. And that is definitely not sustainable for a long run. The fact that they're resorting to that as opposed to borrowing on the foreign markets, obviously, the options for them are very limited.
It's possible. Excuse me, interrupting you, but it's possible. Someone is so risky to have deals with Russia, especially in the financial sector.
I don't think so. I mean, it would have to be some kind of a shady deal with one of the economies that trying to sort of support them in one way or the other, but I don't think they're not capable of participating in the markets in a regular way that, for example, United States can go and borrow more to finance their deficit. Their cost of maintaining that deficit is going to also put another burden on the economy because right now when they borrow money from the banks, they have to pay it back with an interest. And so, which basically means that they have to pay it back and pay the interest, which is part of their budget. Of course, what they can do, because, it's Russia, you can't really sort of put a reasonable, normal economy framework on what they do all the time. But what they can do, they can devaluate their currency and they can let the inflation run a little higher. So what will happen then, but of course they have to balance that with, trying to maintain some kind of standard of living within the economy, but they can let inflation run higher. So when they go to the bank and say like, hey, I'll pay you 1,000, rubles in a year. Well, guess what? 1,000 rubles in a year is not worth as much, because of the inflation. And I wouldn't put it past them because this is a really, really extreme situation. And I honestly think that that's probably what's going to happen. The only thing is that if they were to borrow on a fair, open market where information flows, the cost of borrowing would already include the expectation of the government trying to take advantage of those or expected inflation, devaluation of money, probability of not paying it back. All of that would be priced in the price of the loan. I don't think their market is open. And I think a lot of this is done by backdoor deals because they're trying to make it look like as if everything is, clean and by the law. But the problem is that all that does, it hides the problem under the surface. The problem is still there. They don't have money. The banks don't have money. People don't have savings. And so essentially what they're doing, this is what amounts to quote unquote printing money. Because, the money is created not by necessarily printing the money, but banks excessively loaning to each other by creating so-called money multiplier. There are deposits, there is the money base, and then the banks take the money and then lend it somewhere else. And so this budget financing through this, I think, unfortunately, it will cost them in the long run because they're essentially taking money from the banks to finance the war by not giving a fair market interest rate.
I see. But it's interesting that all of the, let's say, Russian oppositional experts, if I can call them oppositional, so they're not in Russia, but they still very well-known personalities like Guriev Sergei, you know him. So he's telling about the one booming branch of the Russian economy, and it is military. So it's the only sphere that is working on a high speed, but it is non-renewable expenses for the economy, right? So my question is, due to their own production or maybe great imports of components to product some equipment for military, how does this industry really work, and what does it bring to the budget? If it brings anything.
I don't know what the numbers are, frankly, just because I don't trust a lot of numbers coming out. So I think Rio would have better information. I would trust his numbers. The economy. So one of the things that I think we sometimes miss when we think about Russian booming military sector, because it's very easy to start thinking, well, so they're building tanks, so they're creating jobs, and so then there is a demand for components, and then so that now they need to produce more steel, produce more rubber, more whatever it is that they are producing components, right?
The
problem is. Yes, this is the old adage. There's an old story of things seen and things unseen, where similar. It's a very old fallacy in thinking about how economy works. This was the idea was if somebody breaks a window, then the shop owner buys glass. And then the glass.
Yes, sure.
Whoever put the glass, buys a book for the kids and all that. This is exactly the same story. They are fixing a broken window. They are fixing something that didn't need to be fixed by pulling resources away. So for every dollar or whatever $1,000 that they're producing in the military sector, they took that away from somewhere. The workers had to leave other factories and come work. The steel, the resources, all of that had to move from other sectors to be employed by the military industrial complex. And the main thing, think about this. If we think about building a bridge, you build a bridge, you can use it forever. If you build a tank, I don't know what's the lifespan right now is, but I think it's like, if you have someone with javelin on the other side, it's what, seconds? So they basically spend a lot of resources to build things that are fully expendable and are destroyed at a large scale.
Yeah, you can even count how much money they just shut out to the air when they're bombing with missiles or cities. So it's nearly millions and millions of dollars for just one night. Just to scare a little bit, or just not giving us time to sleep at night because of the air defense is working very good right now. So is just throwing away money to the air. They don't count them. But anyways, it's just a little bit lyrics. Let's get to our next point.
I just wanted to point out that fallacy, because I think that's an important, because people be like, hey, it's a booming economy. That's what happened in, United States after World War II or something. No, completely different.
I see. Okay, then let's get to another point. So let's talk about what's going on with the sanctions and its results of the 10th packages. So I'll add a little bit more information. So Yermak and McFall Group showed that the consequences of sanctions on Russian state-owned companies and the private sector, the banking system, and the labor market. State-owned enterprises in 2022 earned 52% less than in the previous years. Profits of Gazprom and Rosneft fell by 72% and 7.9% respectively. The total profits of commercial enterprises decreased by 12.6%. The biggest decline is in mining, oil and natural gas, and the wholesale and retail trade. What strategic sphere of economy still working in the Russian Federation from all these losses that I just named? 90%, 75%. It just the numbers, but it's the people. It's the huge amount of people that working in these industries. So what industry is still working in the Russian Federation?
I think that the only industry that is still working is the mining, the oil and mining industry. Because what happens is that one of the sanctions, and I just wanted to point this out because I don't know if your listeners ever took time to, or many listeners took time to go through the sanction or how the cap works. So when the United States and the coalition have imposed a cap on the oil price that Russia can receive for selling their oil. The reason they did it, the reason they didn't do like a ban or a tax, for example, but had it specifically a cap, is because a cap still allows Russia to get the revenue Of course, I wish they had no revenue. But what that achieved, the reason they did it, is because now Russia has no incentive to pull oil from the world market. They're making far less. So let's say at the price.
I see we lost the connection.
About 40,
yeah, okay, I got you.
Profits, but now when it's 60, their profits essentially were cut in half. I mean, this is roughly matching the. I mean, this is not precise. There are other costs. There is, other considerations, but it's a huge effect, because when you think about price going from 80 to 60, you might think, well, it's only 25% decline, but it's actually a 50% decline of the surplus over the cost. But it still gives them incentive to produce oil. So if you look at the revenues in the revenues and the part of oil revenues that go to the budget, they have declined dramatically. But the quantity, yeah. It hasn't. So Russia is selling as much oil, is putting as much oil in the global market as it did before, or maybe even more. They threatened to cut production, to increase the prices. So presumably consumers in developed world will say, oh, we don't want to support Ukraine because now we're paying a little bit more at the gas station. I say it's a very small price to pay for lives and freedom and the future of civilized world. But Russia was trying to do that. But the rest of the world has called their bluff, because if they reduce the quantity of production, if the prices would go up a little bit in the world market, guess what? Saudi Arabia would say, great, thanks, Russia. Now we can make more money on our oil. They will increase their production. So that was not a credible threat. They basically tried to, bluff their way, and that didn't work. And I don't think it will work. So in other words, even if the cap is reduced, which I think it should be reduced, or be on a path to reduction, have a sort of gradual decline over time, even if that happens, Russia will still be pumping oil because they don't have another source of revenues. So the oil is sold at that lower price, and Russia is getting lower revenues from each barrel of oil. And I think. But the quantity, to your question, the quantity isn't declining. So in other words, somebody is still working, pumping, servicing. So the interesting thing here is that all of those sectors that you mentioned, they still work. They're just not making any money, or they're making much less money. Banking is a very telling story, and it connects to your previous questions about the ability to borrow from the banks. If Russia is really borrowing from the banks and not paying them the full market interest rate, that might be the result of that. Although I don't know, it's hard to say. But that interaction, it'll make it harder and harder to finance their debt as well.
Alexander, but this one more interesting thing, as you said right now, is so-called double standards in what Europe and United States, collective West says about this. Because Putin is openly looking for where to reorient his energy supplies. And it's quite resultive, Russian experts says, who are not in the country, as I mentioned before. But anyways, you mentioned India and China. And in this... in these regions, we understand that maybe not all oil that were bought by China or India are used in China and India. This is double standards. When we hear about some very smart companies from collective Western countries that buy or resell Indian and Chinese oil and gas bought from Russia, but this is still Russian oil. Do you know about these cases?
I don't know much about that, but I would be surprised if that's not happening, because oil is a commodity. Even though different oils that come from different regions, they have different characteristics, but it's still a commodity. So oil is substitutable. Oil from Russia can be used for the same end purposes as oil from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia. So, for example, so there is a lot of substitution is happening, even if the countries are not buying Russian oil. Do you see? So it's just a question of a degree of substitution. So for example, United States doesn't buy a lot of oil from Middle East. United States, actually now United States can export oil. But when the United States was importing oil, the main sources were the neighboring countries, Canada, Mexico, Venezuela. Saudi Arabia was a tiny little percentage. So why did the United States care so much about the oil supplies in the Middle East? And that's because the total global supply will affect prices. So when Russia puts the oil into China and India, they are affecting global quantity. And so some of that will definitely be, I'll be surprised if some of that is not, sold on in terms of products. Or you can take even further, for example, plastics. If China essentially gets a subsidized, oil at a lower prices, they can use it to produce all other materials. So it doesn't have to be oil or fuels. It could be, plastic materials, a million other chemicals that are produced out of oil that then will be put into toys and computers and all kinds of equipment that we'll buy. Unfortunately, I don't think that's something that we would be able to stop. It does create this double standard where you were just saying, we are making Russia receive only $60 per barrel. But then what happens after that, I think it's just a question of feasibility. Even that, because oil revenues are easier to track than revenues, from selling, pencils that may be using plastic that was derived from some kind of petroleum chemical. Honestly, unfortunately, I think it's one of those things that I think it's the West is probably choosing not to fight that war, to find, just because it will be very difficult to achieve.
When we're talking about 11th package of sanction, everybody's talking about this sanction package will affect the third countries that's held to avoid the sanctions for Russian Federation. Talking about this, I want to add some information, for example, from BBC. So BBC writes the next, UK is banning the import of diamonds from Russia. The US sets out similar plans to ban Russian diamonds last year. In the European Union has announced plans to do so. So Russia earned more than £4 billion in 2022 from diamond export, the US says. However, most Russian diamonds are sent to countries like India to be polished, says Hans Market of the International Peace Information Service think tank. And once they are re-exported, it is hard to tell that they originated in Russia. As a result, U.S. sanctions have not been particularly effective, Mr. Market says. A solution could be through laser inscriptions in diamonds or through 3D scans, he said. So this is just one example of how they can get through these borders of sanctions, how much money they can still make. I'm not talking about the sharp number. I'm talking about amounts. All these schemes, like we say, that they're using to avoid these sanctions. On this example,
I think I don't know how that would be difficult to assess. They can definitely use it because remember the old story with blood diamonds, how much it took to actually prevent blood diamonds from the conflict areas to enter the supply chain. The fundamental issue here is that the consumers around the world, they want to impose a certain way the product is produced. It applies to financing, war against Ukraine by Russia. It applies to other things around the world. But this is what we're talking about. I'm just saying it's a very common issue. The one thing that when it's successful, it's when the country that is trying to avoid or trying to certify their products has incentive to do so. So, for example, the countries might want to say this product is not from Russia. And if the sanctions create incentives for Indian sellers to say, hey, we need to make certain steps, like, for example, 3D scanning, laser engraving, if the next consumer in the United States or China, hopefully, or the European Union, if they say, if you want us to buy your products, you have to comply with a certain production and certification process, then I think that would go a long way of curbing demand for diamonds. Because if they can't sell the diamonds on the global market and they are just limited to India, then guess what? Supply and demand works. The prices will have to drop. They will have to accept lower prices. They're still going to be selling it, of course. And but if those diamonds can't make it into the global supply chain, then they will be getting some returns from it, but they won't be able to reap as much benefit if all they can do is just sell to these neighboring countries. By the way, I'm saying just India and China are two enormous economies, so just having that is already too much, I feel. I think India and China can and should do more to stem the revenues that Russia is getting to finance the war.
Talking about these packages, we started this part of our conversation with the McFarlane Earmark group. So I wanted to ask, this is a good initiative, because after this initiative, all the European countries gather their package and unite and give it out to the world. So how effective this group during all this period of time you see, and what else this initiative can propose from our side? How do you think?
I honestly think that the Ukrainian diplomacy has been tremendously effective in pushing a set of sanctions, getting the partners on board, but also being very cognizant of how difficult it is to pass some of these sanctions because of what's happening inside the countries. So some of the countries, or we observe some, resistance, or some political parties in certain countries speaking out, saying things like, "Oh, these sanctions will hurt consumers," or something like that, which is, by the way, not true, or the effects are so small that it's not even worth talking about. But the Ukrainian diplomatic corps, they had, including Yermak, they had the ability to essentially stick to the long-term plan, incrementally put in the sanctions in place, so that every next one is basically tightening the news on all of these products, because some of these are really big and some of these are really small. Sorry, not small, but they're secondary. So, for example, banning exports of high technological equipment to Russia is a big step. So that has already incurred costs on Russian economy, because even if they are finding little schemes to go through, another country, have Belarus buy from somewhere, or Kazakhstan or something like that, all of those, or Armenia, all of those schemes, they're costly. But in terms of what hurts Russia the most, I think it's still oil revenue. Mm-hmm. So I really think that has been single most effective sanction, and I think that targeting other gas, targeting or tightening the restrictions, by lowering the amount of revenue that Russians can get per barrel, that should be the biggest sort of push. Because the sanctions, the price cap is working. So in other words, remember how I said that Russia is pumping quantities into the global market. So when the Western consumers were worried about, shortages of oil, that just didn't happen, because the cap creates incentives for Russians to sell more oil. If we lower the cap, then Russia will try to pump even more oil to increase their revenue. They might say, we're not going to pump any oil, but that's not true. As long as they can cover the cost, which is about $42, they will keep pumping, because it is in their incentive. So they will support the global market by selling oil to the countries that would buy it. The global prices of oil will not increase they might increase for other reasons. For example, global recovery will cause prices to go up, but it has nothing to do with the decrease in supply due to Russia. So I think that is, I think they need to be tightened, and we need to have a plan of tightening them over time so that we leave less and less money for Russian economy to buy bombs.
I wanted to ask you, but maybe you explained already why. It's my guess why still there are not sanctions against Rosneft. Maybe this is the answer to your question. Why?
Yeah, I honestly think that the oil price cap. The goal was to make sure that the world market doesn't collapse. And the U.S. Treasury, they published something. I don't remember, it was a few months ago. They published a little report on the cap, and their conclusion was that it works. So it achieves the goal of having oil in the global, supporting the market, and at the same time. And I think honestly, that's probably the answer. That's probably the answer. They want to keep pumping oil. They're also making it difficult to decrease the cost of production. So the cost of production relies on technology. And because Russian companies are losing access to the cutting edge technology, they have to rely on their own equipment, and that equipment is going to get old.
It takes time.
They can do it for a long time.
It takes time. I understand you. That's why it's very important that you explain why, because people want now and here and very fast, but you really explaining why it cannot be so fast, and it can bring to collapse on the world global level. But anyways, let's be honest, one more thing from you. When some political or economic experts say from different international media about the suffering of people in different countries of Europe because of the sanctions, let's be honest, the recession of economy started not just from full-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine. It started long before, 2 years before, even maybe earlier, from pandemic. 2 years of pandemic and some other financial matters brought to the situation before the war. So can you explain our audience how tough the sanction effects to the economy of different countries, and how tough the other reasons affect the recession of their economy?
I think that the recession is primarily driven by macroeconomic fundamentals. I don't think it's driven by the war to a degree that it was attributed in the beginning. But the problem is that when inflation goes up, it's very easy to look for another big event and say, this is, inflation goes up, there's this other big event, so they have to be connected, but they're not. To say they're not connected is not quite true. So everything is connected, but they're not connected in a way that would, for example, surpass increase in labor force participation coming out of pandemic, demographic changes when more workers are retiring, changes in participation across gender, more women going into the labor force, like all of those across developed world. So all of those things, they are far, far more important for economic growth than the sanctions that have been imposed to Russia. Russia is a tiny, tiny trading partner for relative to other European countries within Europe and with the United States. And the one thing when people tell me this, when they say, when inflation went up, it's because of the war, right? So I always tell them, when it goes down, and it will you also say that's because of the war? Do you see?
Yeah,
so because now inflation is falling. Let's flip around this argument and say, there's a war, so that's why inflation is falling, because we're doing sanctions and we're doing the right thing. It's also not true, but you have to be willing to go, to make that argument if you're willing to go that argument without supporting,
On this example, we just see how easily to manipulate the opinion of societies who doesn't take their time to dig deeper a little bit, to know a little bit more where the start, where the ends. So, I mean, where's the middle? So what starts when? The chicken or the egg? You know what I'm talking about. So let's see.
We know what started this. It was a crazy dictator who decided to invade a neighboring country. This one is easy.
And it started in 2014. Let's remember this too. So let's look a little bit behind the curtains of what's going on in society of Russian Federation and how they survive or they live easily as they used to. So my next information about this. President of Russia, Putin, in March 2022 said that for the death of a Russian soldier in Ukraine, his family will receive almost 7.5 million rubles and additional payments. We saw that families got cars, then fur coats, now it is some wood, food, or even kitchen supplies. When the families realize that what they got has already been spent and they have lost an asset in the form of a husband, will they protest? And when will it be? This is the question from maybe the audience of Ukrainians. But my question is really they suffer or they just got used to it, or the government somehow tries to ease this situation with a little bit loans, with a little bit money given monthly to the workers of a governmental sector. So how they manage to do this, or they just get used to the situation of poverty?
I think this is unfortunately the frog situation. I think they are trying to make things worse incrementally. So what you will see probably is that the amounts that are being paid will be delayed. Their inflation will go up, and the amounts will not be indexed. I think another thing that's going to happen. By the way, I don't know if the car costs. If the $7.5 million is the cost of a car that they're being given. So in other words, it could be that, they're trying to hide the actual expenditure because, if it's a government enterprise that's producing some kind of, wood, chopping wood or whatever the stories are, or some equipment or, a car or appliances, they're essentially trying to not to give the full amount, but just to give the cost of producing those items, And so that's, of course, that's if it's government owned. I think that this is the story of boiling the frog. The water gets hotter and hotter, and people just kind of, slowly getting used to it. That's what that the Russian government for sure is very aware of this issue. That's why they're giving a little something instead of nothing. That's why they are, drafting not from Moscow and St. Petersburg, where there could be potential for revolt. They're drafting people from further and further from far remote areas of Russia, so it's not visible that the war is having such a devastating effect on the communities, and they'll just keep doing it. The one thing is that I will say is that first, it has a limit, and then second, if you remember the fall of the Berlin Wall and then 1991, everything seemed fine one day, and then everything was horrible and collapsing the next day. And unfortunately, that's what's going to happen with Russia. And I think the problem is that it's very difficult to predict such structural breaks. We're very good at predicting, well, if oil price goes up by 5 cents, how much more revenues will somebody get? We can figure that out. But the question is, when will the suffering of Russian consumers and workers and citizens be so bad that they will revolt? That's a very hard one to predict. I can say it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, but I don't know where is that threshold, because the ability to adapt is definitely getting, that's what's been sustaining part of this muted response to sanctions. And then another thing, but just remember, when you look at the budget, right, the biggest part of the budget is social expenditures. So military is not the biggest part of the budget, even in Russia, even during war. So they are essentially trying to, there's a lot of room to start cutting little programs, and then, as I said, they'll try to cut them at the, in faraway regions so that nobody rebels, and it's just going to keep happening and happening. The one thing I'll tell you though is that, think about this: if you were in a position of Russian government trying to cut and trying to find these sources, the first sources you will use are the easiest ones to implement. So the one thing that's happening for sure is the sources are harder and harder to find. So in other words, first you cut something that you'll be like, we don't need so many, police officers in this town, then maybe not so many teachers. But then next time you want to cut, now all of a sudden you're making a big change. Instead of, you might have to close a school, close a hospital, not fix a bridge. So those are much bigger changes. And unfortunately, I think that's where it's going to, that after exhausting all these little sources of savings, the government will have to make more drastic cuts. And by that time, I think that will precipitate, higher level of dissatisfaction.
The only thing that helps now in the social sector of Russia may be that pharmaceutical and food supplies are not in the sanction list. So this is the only thing that saves more or less lives yet still. But it's not the limits. I mean, the food cards that will be implemented, that's not the limits that will stop Russian society from serving Putin, right?
I don't think so. Just seeing the level of poverty, seeing, hearing firsthand stories of, how soldiers behaved in the houses of Ukrainians when they occupied them, in Bucha and Irpin. I mean, it's just disgusting. So, we're talking about a different level of civilization. So when you sort of say that, you will live a little bit uncomfortably, your standard of living is going to drop, it's already so low. And in some parts of Russia, and the people who live on subsistence level, they're going to get their food from, the garden, and they don't care about the appliances and things like that, And so because of that, I don't think that, it will take a while. I guarantee you that it affects them. It's just that for them to feel it, it's going to take a longer time than we might think.
I just add a little bit from our international colleagues that are writing about this, the sanctions and what the effects on the ordinary people. So more than 1,000 people have left Russia, depriving the country of future investment in oil and technology. Another major problem with short-term consequences and dire long-term consequences is population decline. As you mentioned, there have long been problems with low birth rates and high death rates in this country. COVID has taken a heavy toll. Many were killed or badly wounded in a battle here in Ukrainian lands. Others fled the country. So there more and more consequences will be on the ordinary people in Russia. And in this situation, I remember this story about the cow. To get more milk, you have to feed the cow, but not on the contrary, What I read today in the newspapers of Russia, the Russian Business Association has called on the labor ministry to consider moving to a 6-day work week so that they can better deal with fallouts from Western sanctions. Kremlin-controlled media reported on Monday. So what effects will it have if the people don't get enough money for 5-day week of job, working week? And now they will have to work 6 days. So their laws become more and more stupid.
They will have to, in a normally functioning labor market, it's tempting to say that good luck finding workers, but their labor market is not normally functioning competitive labor market. And because of that, what will happen is that those who can find other jobs or leave or retire or stay home or garden and sell the produce on the market or whatever other alternatives available to them, they will quit their jobs on the margin. But there's also a lot of people who don't have that choice, and they will stay under, 6-day work week. The one thing that we do know from the studies is that the motivation of the workers is affected quite a bit by the working conditions. And so telling workers that they have to work an extra day when they don't want to. So in other words, forcing them to work, it will definitely reduce the morale. There's probably going to be more shirking, more stealing, more absenteeism, more alcoholism, lower quality of products. Because if a place requires attention and you have to kind of care about your product, you're not going to care if somebody tells you, no, you have to go and work on Saturday because of a war that was started, and you were told that, oh no, this is something special operation or whatever they're calling that, and now all of a sudden, it was started on your behalf, and now you are suffering the consequences. Honestly, I think they should absolutely do it. It's a horrible idea, but I think it's going to work. It's going to work to our advantage.
Okay, we'll observe this situation, and our last item is about military economy of Russian Federation. Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Minister of Industry and Trade, Denis Manturov, said that in the first quarter of 2023, Russia produced more tanks than in the whole of 2022, and the total volume of military production in 2023 will quadruple. At the end of April, Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin stated that delays in the delivery of all necessary equipment to the Russian armed forces are unacceptable. He said that troops continued to be supplied with all necessary weapons and equipment, and the issues of medical and social support for the participants in the special military operation were being addressed. Mishustin said that the measures had earlier been taken to expand the production capacity of the defense industry and increase the production of the most requested products. So my question is, has Russia already switched to a military economy? Absolutely.
I think they are trying to do their best. I think they behave as if they were a Soviet Union where they can mobilize people. But they also understand that if they truly mobilize people and they put everybody, working for the military, then the cost will become unbearable. And I think they're afraid of doing it. So in other words, this whole on one hand, Russia is a autocratic society, but on the other hand, there is enough freedom there that they're still afraid of the popular uprising. And I don't think they're afraid of people, a democratic government taking over the power. I think they're afraid of another faction within the government say hey, we're with people. We want to stop the war. We want to save lives. So go with me, and then just replace Putin with another autocratic regime. And so that's why they, I think they're trying to kind of, balance. They're still trying to balance that, So back to the military economy, that's why I think that they have limits to what they can do. So in other words, they have existing plans. They will try to run them as much as they can. They'll probably run them 24 hours if they can. But first, they will start breaking. They'll need more equipment. They'll need more supplies. They're cutting some deals, I'm sure, with China and India or Iran, whoever can get them, or whatever countries that are helping them circumvent or help produce some of the components. But I think there are limits to it, because before that, this is not my thought. I think other observers and analysts have noticed that. I mean, Russia is a corrupt country with a small group of people who are trying to exploit the rest of the economy and collect ridiculous profits, to enrich themselves. That hasn't changed. The war didn't change it. If anything, it probably made it more acute. So to say that Russia now all of a sudden will be, high technologically advanced and they will find some reserves, I don't think that's true, because they could have been, there's not that many reserves. They're limited by the quality of their labor force, by the aging equipment that now will age even faster. And so I think what Mishustin said is probably true. That's probably what they're trying to do. But I'm very skeptical about the long-term viability of such shift. And also go back to the broken window. I mean, the money to pay people has to come from somewhere, and that money has to come from the budget. There's no private citizens in Russia who decide to buy a tank, so that money comes from budget. And where is it going to come from? Taxing more, borrowing more. Both of those things making, they will lead to an increase in the budget deficit. And even though budget deficit in the short run, it can be covered by all these little remedies. The thing with the budget deficit is that it amplifies the problems in the financial sector, and it also reduces the set of available solutions. Because once you have a budget deficit, and if you want to avoid inflation, there's really not that many options. You have to be selling out your reserve. You have to be borrowing money from whoever will borrow you, which in Russia's case internally, and those are not good choices. Those are very costly choices that will create budget pressure and inflationary pressure in the long term. So them putting more money to produce tanks and equipment and military equipment is, I understand that, like Mishustin tried to make it sound like it's a good thing. It's not a good thing. They're basically saying we took resources from a bunch of other parts of the economy. We employed them here to be producing things that will be destroyed very soon.
Yeah. And
to do this, we're going to borrow from the other people who are not working to pay for these things that will be destroyed very soon. So it's a double, hit.
And make our population work not 5 but 6 days to produce all this stuff. Crazy situation. I would like
Why not 7?
Yeah, I would like to end our conversation with what we started. You said about the 11 package of sanction and its long-term perspective of effectiveness of all the packages that were implemented before. But as I understand, the long-term perspective is a disaster for Russia. That's true. It's understandable from what we just discussed with you. But for Ukraine, it is just catastrophic. Absolutely catastrophic. And my question is, what else can collective West do to stop Putin as soon as it's possible, as soon as it's in time still? I mean, do you see that the West switched to a military economy too to help Ukraine to stop the war as soon as possible?
The funny thing about the U.S., so the West is increasing their military production.
Shortly,
but
please.
The capacity... But the capacity of the West is tremendously higher. The West has the resources, labor force, know-how, and technology. The equipment that is given to Ukrainians and is making a huge difference on the battlefield, like HIMARS, for example, that's not new military equipment. The U.S. and the Western capabilities, quality of the equipment is just so much better than Russian. So I think so what I'm saying is that the Western countries saying that they're switching to military economy or increasing their participation, they're talking about fairly incremental changes to their economy. So in other words, they're essentially saying, we will do things the way we did and trying to find resources to increase our military spending. Russia is trying to basically change their economy completely. The West is not going to feel it. The Russia is going to feel it. Because remember, it's Russia trying to match the expenditures or the increase in military production in the West. And there also a lot of the equipment that's coming to Ukraine is coming from the stockpiles. So that doesn't have an immediate effect. So of course, the countries will be producing to replace the missings for the stockpile. But I just think that when we say, shifting to the military or whatever war economy, it's very different from Russia than it is for the West. But to your question, what needs to be done? I'm going to emphasize again, the oil revenues have to be targeted consistently and persistently, and we can do more. But the second thing is, I don't understand personally, why does it take so long for the rest of the world to understand that Russia is a real danger? And if Ukrainians did not stand up on the first days of this full-scale invasion, the Russia would be in Moldova. They would be knocking on the doors of NATO, and they would not care. And I think the same thing in Central Asia. So I think the West has to give Ukraine all it needs to resist and to defeat Russia as soon as they can, just because then we can switch to the long-run recovery and the long-run effect of sanctions and have that prevent Russia from doing it in the future. But in the short run, Russia just has to be stopped because, they came
it
to
might
Ukraine,
be catastrophic, not for Ukraine, but for the whole continent, for example.
Absolutely.
Just to start
Absolutely.
the continent. So there's going to be the items for next discussions, what can happen in other countries, but other times. So thank you very much for your detailed explanation in our program, Alexander. Thank you.
It's always, you're welcome. It's always a pleasure. You ask very pointed questions, and it's a pleasure to answer them.
Thank you. My pleasure, too. So now, thank you very much for our audience, for your time to be with us. I'm Ksenia Smirnova, and it's my show, Talk for More Details. So join us at the gates, and thank you for your trust. See ya.